everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And I'm joined today by musician and composer Martin Green to talk about the audio drama Keli and the album Split the Air, the latter being performed at Celtic Connections on the 3rd of February. But first, hello, Martin.
Hello, thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Now, there's so much to discuss. So I'm going to say to you, I'm going to put the pressure on you and say, where would you like to start in describing these projects and how they came about?
Okay, so I'll start with, I am originally from England, but I moved to Midlothian and I live very close to the Scottish Mining Museum. And one day, driving through Newton Grange, which is where it is, I encountered a thing called Brass in the Park, which sadly doesn't happen anymore, but it was a mass gathering of brass bands on the green and also outside the Mining Museum. And I love any music really, but I love any public music. I think it's a truly wonderful thing. So I knew nothing really about brass bands, but I stopped and I hung around and I watched several generations of people playing music together in a very meaningful way. And the fact that they were right by the Mining Museum, which is, that is a pithead, that I'd never seen this kind of connection of music and vocation quite so extremely. I come from traditional music, and obviously that is after work music of working people in a similar way, but it's not quite so black and white. And there's a lot more to brass bands than coal, and that's important to say. However, that I just thought, oh right, this is fascinating. I've moved to this place. I moved here to play folk music, but there's this whole other thing here of a different sort of music and a lifestyle. And actually something fundamentally geological about where I've moved to, but it's all sort of hidden now because obviously there's no mining by the time I arrived. So this was how I fell in love with brass bands and became interested in sort of how this bit of Scotland where I now live, it kind of is like it is now, or some aspects of that, So Radio 4 very kindly commissioned a series, a documentary series about brass bands. So I did all these interviews. And as I started doing that, I fell in love with some of those specific people that I interviewed, but also a kind of mindset about brass banding, which is obsessive and competitive, but warm and welcoming and inclusive. And it's like, well, there's a paradox there. And so all of that seemed quite like a rich theme, and I'm also interested in trade unions and industrial action, and that is an ever pertinent thing to think about. So yeah, that was how I ended up falling in love with the huge kind of spider's web of it all. And then these specific bits, the audio drama, came out of a love of making stories and sound, really, and this seemed like a rich topic to do it on, and the album, I suppose that feels like that's my wheelhouse. That's what I've been doing for most of my life is making records. That was a long answer.
I knew it would be, which is why I wanted to answer it in that way, because as I say, and before we get into the specifics, it's so interesting to me because I was thinking that so many forms of music are perhaps better known now than they perhaps ever were. I'm thinking of Scottish jazz at the moment, which has got high profile. Folk music seems to be, across the generations, as it maybe wasn't for some time. Choral music even gets spots on television where choirs are put together and all these things. But brass band music absolutely isn't. In fact, I had to think the last time I'd even thought about brass band music, and it was probably the film Brassed Off. It was probably as far back as that. And I was wondering whether that's partly to do with the communities, which are often the industry of those communities is no longer functioning as it was, and therefore not only is perhaps the community forgotten, but the music that went on there forgotten. Is that something to do with it?
And I think so. One thing I would say that's very positive about brass banding is that the scene is very healthy. There are lots of brass bands and they're very active and they work very hard to kind of keep themselves active, but they exist primarily in a competition circuit. Yeah. And so unless you're interested in that, you don't see them. I think Whitburn Band, who I've been working with the most, they do, they still do an armistice march, for example, which they did the other day. They are still visible in the community. I was talking to the band leader. He had various kind of switching on of town lights that they're running around. But I don't think it's like it was. I don't think that there are many bandstands, for example. You know, people don't go on a Sunday afternoon and listen to the band. So I do think that's changed. One of the interviews that I did with an ex-miner said something interesting, which was that he felt communities had stopped talking about about the strike, but also about the collapse of industry. And perhaps there was a certain amount of collective trauma that made people just want to move on, which I thought was an interesting thing to consider. So I'm not quite sure. But also, of course, fashions change and tastes change. And the sound of the brass band is intrinsically nostalgic. And so I think it, having tried, so Keli is set in the present. So when we were making the score, tried to make something which seems contemporary, that we can believe it is a 17-year-old right now, but with the sound, because the brass band is going to take you straight to Yorkshire in the 1950s. There's almost nothing you can do about that. And so trying to work out how to make that keep that thing that is so heartwarming, but also make that sound a little bit more contemporary, has been an interesting challenge.
Yeah. Again, just a slight aside, I think about how piping live is a big thing now on television. The piping finals are on television. There's another music that you could say is nostalgic. And I thought, well, why isn't that happening with brass music? You would think there would be something similar along those lines. But maybe it's not global. The brass band, it's a global thing. There are people come from Canada and from New Zealand and places to, maybe brass band is very much UK and maybe northern UK.
I think that is a good point. There are European brass band championships, but they are less. They seem to be less the focus for these championship bands than what they call the nationals, which is in London. And so that, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a smaller thing there, but I also think folk music has had these interesting revivals, partly because it can tour, you know. So you can have at various points in time Bob Dylan, Martin Cathy, whoever it is that gets associated with these ideas of revival, but they can kind of run around the world doing their thing. Brass bands are not professional institutions, so they can't, they're all going to work 9 to 5. And then, so, and there's 30 people traveling. So I think there's something in the nimbleness of folk music maybe that allows it to spread its own word a bit more. Piping, I think, is a really equivalent scene in many ways. There's a lot of focus on competition and excellence, and both of those things breed very high standards, which is exciting, but also a sporting mentality which works really well for some people, and some people find it very difficult. I think it partly depends if you win. I think for kids, it's like the folk musicians I know that did competition as a child and didn't win found it all a bit harrowing, I think. You know?
Yeah, because I guess it's that idea of winning and not just taking part, and particularly maybe in the arts and music, that's very rarely thought of as that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talk about Keli. I was listening to it again, at least the first episode again before we started to talk, and it's really interesting because, well, first of all, you think about, you talked about preconceptions. When I first heard it, I thought, what is a Scottish woman doing in Yorkshire? Because I presumed that's where the background would be for the band, and I hadn't read that it was Whitburn and it's Ventral Belt. And then when I realised, when you heard the other characters, oh no, that's not the way it works. The music itself is almost used to reflect Keli's state of mind. Is that right? It gets sort of more discordant and.
That if that's how it comes across, I'm really delighted to hear that. Yes, I think audio drama is a really flawed medium in many ways. I think there are things that you have to do about so much expositional script because you have to say, I am here with this person holding this, because you can't see anything. But what I think it does really well is get inside people's heads, especially if you're lucky enough that people are listening on headphones, then you have this. It's the most direct form of art into the brain that I can imagine. Yeah. So there, I feel like I think Hitchcock would have made the most amazing audio drama. Like this, the unease, I think, is one of the things that audio plays really well. So yeah, the underscore, I hope, or almost everything is sort of Kelly's point of view. And
yeah,
I had this fantasy that we would record it all with Keli wearing this, like wearing binaural microphones, and she would literally move through the whole of the thing. That turned out to be impractical for many reasons, but that's the idea, really. If we're in Kelly's head,
And I think you're right about that kind of intimacy, because immediately you start to care about Keli and worry for her, because you're getting it straight to you, it's straight in your ears. There's nothing to distract you from it, not the way we get explanations of slightly of how she looks and things like that, but you don't see it, so you're not taken out of it. You don't make preconceptions in that sense, and so how did the character come about? Because it's a great character.
Thank you. For me, she's an amalgam of so one of the things is I've got teenage kids going to school in my kids go to school in Dalkeith, so they go to school in an ex-mining area, and I spend a lot of my time thinking, what's it like being a teenager right now? So that's something that I'm interested in. And another is that there's been so much brilliant kind of period work set in the strike, like set in the 80s in the strike, and I had originally thought that's what we were going to make, and the first draft of it was set in the 80s, and then I felt like actually there's some of this has been said before, and some of it's been said better than this before anyway, so what's the point? But what does it mean now seemed like something that I was seeing less of. So that's kind of why Keli is the age she is. I have a love of fiery tongued expletives. So I am quite interested in people, because Keli swears a lot, but it's not, and I think, and this is a conversation I've had with producers and presenters and stuff, it's like, because the swearing is a barrier for some people.
Yeah.
And the argument gets given quite a lot, but it represents what I'm hearing around me. And that's definitely true. Like, I live in a life surrounded by swearing, but actually what I was more interested in is I live in a life where I'm surrounded by people that are very eloquent, but don't talk like Radio 4. Mm-hmm. And I'm really interested in that, partly maybe because I've come here from somewhere else, and having lived in Cambridge for a long time, where people talk in a very different way, and there are eloquent people everywhere, but it's a bit like falling in love with Scottish folk music. It's like, oh, I love the way that I've learned so many words since I moved to Scotland. There just are more words here, and so that's exciting. So I think, other than being in Scotland and wanting to work in Scotland and work with kind of Scotland-based people, I was just really, I love the music of what I hear around me, and a childish love of people saying swear words. Yeah.
But I think actually it's so good that it is set when it's set today, because one, it's a reminder that the music's still going on, and also there's a bit where she says, "Oh, old such and such," who would have been about 15 when mining stopped. And you think, to someone who's young, that seems like ancient history, but to me, who's in his 50s, that's not that long ago. And these things are very much still in your mind. That swathes of industry were just kind of halted in their tracks.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it does seem like a long time ago to a lot of people. I mean, it's so, 2024 will be 40 years since 1984 and the beginning of the miners' strike, which which is a very different length of time if you're 17 or 30 or 80, and I'm somewhere in the middle. I remember the strike, and I knew what side my household was on, but I didn't understand the intricacies of it. So one of the other things which has been interesting is talking to people about the kind of chess game of that. That doesn't really come up in Keli, but it's just been interesting to kind of learn about what the objectives of various sides might have been, and the whole thing is much more tactical, of course, than it comes across, when all I remember really is those kind of huge bits of pickets and police on BBC News as a kid.
I mean, you're absolutely right, that changed, because then I was comparing it to myself and thinking, when I was 15, 40 years before was the end of the Second World War, and that definitely seemed like history. So, it does really kind of change your perceptions in that way. And how did you find your Keli? You've got Anna Russell Martin in the role. Was that easy to find? Or?
It was easy to find because I wrote it for Anna. Anna had done a piece called The Portal, which we did in the heavy lockdown. And so I'd never met her, but we'd done all this work, and I'd already started on this, on what turned into Keli, and increasingly this young woman became the central character. That was not how it started off. It was a much more kind of ensemble piece, of which Keli was a person, but increasingly, I suppose partly because it's about someone who's young and virtuosic. And so it just felt like, okay, it's kind of a concerto for an actor now. Like, Kelly's in every scene. She doesn't, I mean, she did more than every scene, because she's, a lot of the time she's narrating her own scene as you hear it. So I felt like they were equivalent at the same time with the music. The horn part was written for a tenor horn player called Shona White, who's been my favorite tenor horn player for a long time. He's an amazing musician. But I knew both those voices before I wrote either the music or the script, which would always be my preference if you're lucky enough to be in that situation. And it makes it easy to write as well, I think, if you can hear a voice while you're doing it.
That's interesting. And we should say, without giving away any spoilers, but Keli's story is that she's a young brass band prodigy, younger than most who would be in that position. And this causes, it's an escape for her, but there's pressures as well that come along with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And because she's a soloist, to a certain extent, the band wins or loses on her, and she's got to score those goals. And this is both exciting for her and, as you say, an enormous pressure. And everything else is quite tricky for Keli. And she falls out with people, but I love Keli deeply. And I think we've all had conversations with people where our tongues move faster than our brains, And I think especially when you're younger and you haven't quite learned how to. And Keli's brain is very fast and her tongue is very fast, so quite often it's gone far too far before she pulls herself back into check, which is just fun to write, really. And Anna's so good at doing it.
So you have this audio drama, and you mentioned the album split the air. Was there always going to be this kind of split? Were you always going to do an album as well?
Yes, I think that feels, in some ways, that feels like the core bit, or at least the bit that I feel I know how to do. The album is the brass band that got put together for the album, who were a kind of bespoke band. It wasn't Whitburn. They were so good, and it was such a joy to record with them. And the process there was to kind of get the music recorded in its naked form, and then I spent quite a while playing around with electronics and doing bits of production to try and find this thing that I was chasing of the bit of the brass band that hits you in the chest, and at the same time something a bit more contemporary that fitted with, I suppose, the aesthetic of other things that I make.
And is there spoken word on the album as well?
No, the album's just music, and I think it's quite a mellow album on the whole. It's not kind of, it's much more kind of massive reverbs and tingly delays.
So it's got kind of essence of the brass band there, but you're doing something new with it.
Yeah, the brass band is absolutely there all the way through it, and then there are bits of treatment that pull it into a slightly more 21st century palette, I suppose.
And when you were getting the stories behind the bands, behind the music together, did you do? I mean, you mentioned the documentary. Was that a set of interviews with people who were involved?
Yes, absolutely. So it was so 3 parts. So 3 half-hour programs on the modern brass band scene. They Radio 4 were reasonably broad in what they wanted, but what they kept saying was Radio 4 is more about people than it is about music. Right. So it so the music, so there was music in there, but you never hear a whole piece of music. So I went to the national finals and interviews with people there. Broadly speaking, the things that I've found most exciting were the safe spaces it could be anything. It could be football, it could be anything, but the safe spaces that youth organizations provide for people is really vital. And so the stories that came out about kind of well-being seemed the most universal, which I think is useful, especially in kind of broadcast radio, because people don't tune in quite the same way. They get in their car and it's on or whatever. So try to find these universal things. So this idea that creativity is good for well-being, going and doing stuff, being with other humans is good, but also physically having a safe space to go to got brought up in more than one interview, and it's like, okay, this is a really vital thing. The brass bands are in some areas the only place where you can get an instrument without paying for a child to play. Yeah. There might be the only free music tuition in some areas. And so this is a really remarkable self-organizing system that should be celebrated for a load of reasons that are actually nothing to do with the noise they produce, and like I say, the same would be true of youth drop-ins and boxing. But the one that I was looking at, those were the stories that affected me the most, and also stories of people that found other bits of life really difficult, but had this meticulous control of their instruments. And that's because this is weirdly because of competition. I think there's so much focus on practice, they become very athletic, and that becomes really connected to your mental health because you become very in control of this tiny bit of the universe. Yeah. And if the rest of your existence is quite overwhelming, then you understandably you cling on to that control. And that's really what Keli is. That's the overlap there. The brass band is her safe space, but it's also the bit of the universe where she excels, where she, what she might do with the rest of her life is not really very obvious to Keli, but whether or not she might become the best tenor horn player in the world is actually an attainable possibility. And someone can say it because it's brass banding. So it's like, you are officially the best tenor horn player in the world. It's like, there's something quite relaxing and finite about sport, you know? So those all those things I found wonderful, and I encountered very little bitterness. Maybe though, I'm not saying that maybe those people just don't want to be interviewed, but I didn't encounter it's shit when you lose as
Yeah.
much as I encountered it's brilliant when you win, which as somebody that doesn't really engage in sport, I was like, okay, that actually has changed my idea. I came away with a completely different idea about competition, having gone in thinking art should never be competitive.
Yeah.
I kind of came out going, actually, if you're a 12-year-old kid and you want to know next week I can run the 100 meters faster than I could this week, that's really useful, to keep you doing it, So, yeah, it's great. And yeah.
It's also the individual in the team. Most teams, if they're going to sport, they'll maybe have standout individuals, but you can only do it together as a team, and it'll be the same. And there's that support that you're only as good as your weakest link or whatever it may be.
Yeah. And also, it's like anything, if you get far enough into it, it's super nerdy, and I just love that. There are all these weird kind of idiosyncrasies that I've hung over from, some of it's in Italian and some of it's in English, and it's not quite like, it's got bits of classical music, it's got bits of military music. It is this weird but fixed shape of 9 cornets and 1 flugelhorn. Well, that's weird. Do you know what I mean? Like, so yeah, it's brilliant. It's a great thing.
So as a musician, you found some really interesting kind of ways that people had worked in terms of brass music.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The repertoire is sort of split into 2 parts. They commission a lot of music brass bands, which is great because they keep needing new test pieces.
Right.
And so they are this very active commissioner of very specific sort of music, because a test piece needs to show various things, and they're sort of all quite similar, but they're brilliant, and there are some fantastic composers doing it. So there's part of the repertoire is test pieces, and part of the repertoire is kind of light music, so a lot of covers, obviously the Christmas and the hymns. In some ways, my hymns are my favorite because it's a homogenous ensemble. They're all making the same noise, and those hymn settings are so beautifully, like these rock solid array. So I live in a kind of like reasonably newly built house, which is going to fall over well before I'm dead. Those hymns feel like those buildings that you're in, that it's like, yeah, this was medieval when they built it and will still be there 150,000 years. So I love hearing them do that. Yeah.
That's interesting, because I've not been in a Church of Scotland church since I was about 15 or something like that, but there is still something reassuring about hearing certain hymns of my youth done in that, in those spaces and in certain ways where you go, yeah. I don't know whether that's a nostalgia or a kind of safety or what it is, but I can understand that.
Leaping to the defense of your inner psyche, I think it could also be that they're beautiful. I don't think it is necessarily.
No, absolutely, yeah.
But yeah, and of the things that I learned, some of them were about kind of immediately where I live, because I suppose there are more people in the central belt. The kind of top bands of Scotland, well, Whitburn, Whitburn and the Co-op, but they're both, in the central belt. Like, there are bands around where I live, but meeting miners from Midlothian was really interesting, and kind of realize, if there's 7 stages of separation or whatever it is between all humans, there's 1.5 tops in brass band world. You start talking to people, and they were all in a youth band with this person, and so that's lovely when you kind of find yourself in the middle of someone else's social spider's web.
Do you find similar in the folk music that there's a similar kind of?
Absolutely, yeah, and they I feel that they face similar challenges. because I think both brass banders and folkies are interested in, partly they're interested in doing something that's been going on for a long time for whatever reason. Maybe like you say about hymns, there's something comforting about doing something that's been going on for a long time. However, they both face the problem of relevance, and so those things are interesting. They also both, at least in in this country, come out of kind of after work self-made entertainment, so that they are working class traditions that come from very specific areas, and so they have a very particular demographic that are drawn to doing it. And I think both scenes are interested in trying to broaden the diversity of the people playing that music. And I think it's really challenging in both instances, because partly because the context means something different, but also because they're both kind of multi-generational. A lot of the folk musicians I know play because their parents played.
Yeah.
A lot of the brass banders play because their parents. How you broaden out then the diversity of the people playing it, I think is a challenge for both sides that people are rightly thinking about, but has no particularly obvious answer.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting. That, and it's almost, if not expected, certainly not worried about if someone says I'm going to be a musician, if parents have been musicians or grandparents have been in that world. Whereas for other people, it's like, that's going to be a precarious thing to follow.
Yeah.
And Split the Air's going to be at Celtic Connections. What's that live show going to be like?
So that'll be with Whitburn, and Celtic Connections feels in many ways like my spiritual home. So I feel like I found this really exciting, wonderful, shiny jewel, and I'm bringing it home to show everyone. So that it's predominantly a music show. It's sort of a little bit of what went into the radio show in terms of, there's a bit of discussion of the history of brass bands. There's a certain amount of marking 40 years since the miners' strike. So it's intercut with interviews. So we hear from people involved in the strike, and we hear about the band's relationship with the strike. We hear about Whitburn's relationship with mining, and all of this has a kind of live underscore. And then we have a little crossfade into fiction. And by the end of it, Keli's standing on a stage live talking to us with a brass band behind us. It's a very exciting thing to be working on. I think a guy called Tom Morris, who made the show called Warhorse, is directing that, and he obviously has a great relationship with theatre, but he has a really great relationship with music. So it's been really great to kind of go to him and go, I've got all this ideas and bits of music, and can we make a coherent story? And he's been really useful. And storytelling as a craft is less immediately the same as playing music than I had realized. Right. And so every time I do one of these sorts of things, audio drama or whatever it is, I learn a little bit more about that. And I love a learning curve in general, but I'm really enjoying that. I hadn't realized folk music, people talk about beginning, middle, and end. A lot of folk music is just middle. Like, we just start in the middle, like just start dancing and then just stop. And you don't have to contextualize it. I don't need to know why you're playing a reel. You just play it and then you stop, So that's been great. And learning a little bit of that craft has been really exciting for me. We're also developing a stage play of Keli, which is a very slow process, and that's I suppose a similar thing of learning about this craft of storytelling. Audio's very forgiving, I have learned, partly because it's free to edit. So you don't have to get a load of actors in the room, and it doesn't cost loads of money to go down dead alleys, especially in a pandemic. Audio is like, I mean, we finished it earlier this year, but we started I suppose I started writing at the beginning of 2021. It's a perfect medium for it. You know, if you're lucky enough to own a microphone and a laptop, like, great. Just sit and make up little stories. It's great. Yeah.
That sounds like an amazing night, though, when you put all those aspects together.
Sorry, I completely forgot the fucking question. Sorry.
The question,
Well
the
done.
question was about the Celtic Connections night, but you know, it sounds like theatre as much as it is concert.
Yeah, it's theatrical presentation of music, which sounds like a dreadful idea, but that's what we're calling it. And so, yeah, I talk a bit and get excited about brass bands as they play, and so it's a little bit Peter and the Wolf, or it's a little bit like I don't know if you ever get on YouTube and watch Bernstein talk about music and get all excitable, which I love to do. So it's a little bit like that, and go, isn't this thing wonderful? Let's fall in love. And then there's a little bit of challenge from Keli when she comes alive and kind of goes, I don't think this thing is as primary coloured as you think it is. And we did a kind of work in progress of it as in this incarnation at the Lyceum last year, and it's really exciting when it all comes together, because there's so many, you know, there'll be 39 of us on stage or something. Wow. So it's hard to have a lot of rehearsal. So it's, by the time you actually get to do it on a stage, it feels precious. It feels like I know how lucky I am to get to do it at all. So it's all, you know, it's like a dream, like a really loud dream.
And you mentioned Celtic Connections feeling like a spiritual home, and you're also a member of the great folk band Low, who have got 2 other events at Celtic Connections. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So we have been doing a show called Unplugged, and we will do the kind of last of those. It feels lovely. We did the first of them at Celtic Connections 2020. Then there was a big gap in our schedule for some reason, and now we're kind of bookending that, doing it. We're gonna finish off doing that show, but we'll do it once more at Celtic. So that'd be great. And then we are helping the SCO, the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, celebrate their birthday with a load of other brilliant people that are on that night as well, which will be wonderful and beautiful. So yeah, it's great. Celtic have been really, the first piece of music that I was ever commissioned to make was from Celtic Connections as part of their New Voices series, and I think it was a huge leap of forward thinking to start commissioning traditional musicians, because that before then it wasn't something that occurred to people very much. It's not historically part of what happens in folk music. So I really, I mean, I'm, you know, I don't need to tell you, you're obviously like very aware of what goes on in Scottish culture, but I really think Celtic Connections has changed what Scottish music is internationally, not just in Glasgow. So yeah, it's wonderful, and it's a bit like a wedding, because there are people that I only see, you know, when a cousin gets married, you know, but it's in the middle of Sauchiehall Street in -2 degrees at the end of January, you know.
And I agree with you about Celtic Connections. I think as it's gone on and progressed, it's absolutely changed the standing of Scottish music, not just folk music, but all sorts of music across the board. Definitely. Martin, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fascinating.
No, an absolute pleasure. And yeah, if you want to come to the show in Glasgow, give me a shout.
I certainly will do. And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.